I'm so excited to be here. I've been trying to get up here for 4 years and finally I've made it. So thank you for having me. In my talk, I'm going to be talking about unplanned pregnancy decisions. So, of course, many of the people in this room will have their own fertility stories. And I don't know if my talk will bring anything up for anybody here. I hope that it won't. But I just want to make it clear before I start that if it does bring up any difficult or emotive stuff, it's perfectly fine to leave the room. Okay, thank you. Okay, so the question. When Pip got unexpectedly pregnant after a few tumbles with Toby at Lower Loxley, it got me thinking, how do the decisions by Ambridge women compare to the rest of the UK? Do they reflect the decisions made by other women in the UK? Or do Ambridge women make different choices? Is it fair even to extrapolate? I'm going to explore the choices made by 4 local women faced with a difficult decision, and I'll try to frame them, where possible, in the national context. So, what is the national context? In the UK, 1 in 3 women will experience abortion in their lifetime. Around 1 in 6 pregnancies in the UK is unplanned, and a further third are considered ambivalent, leaving only 55% of pregnancies as fully intended events. According to The Lancet, only around 6% of unplanned pregnancies go to term, with more than half ending in abortion and another third in miscarriage. For those pregnancies classed as ambivalent, only a third make it to full term. Okay, let's frame that against the Ambridge experience. Since the Archers began, there have been approximately a dozen storylines relating to unplanned or unwanted pregnancy, from Jennifer Archer with Adam in 1966 through to the birth of soon-to-be christened Rosie in 2018. 2 of these storylines have ended in abortion and 2 in miscarriages. Now, unexpected pregnancy yields different reactions in the Archers, just as it does in real life. Susan's pregnancy with Emma expedited a marriage proposal from Neil. Kate infamously decided not to take mum Jennifer's advice about having an abortion and instead gave birth to Phoebe in a tent in Glastonbury. Tom and Kirsty's night of passion in 2017 ultimately ended in a miscarriage, turning their worlds upside down for a second time after he spectacularly ditched her at the altar in 2014. Now, I've chosen to focus on 4 of the pregnancy stories. Helen Archer, Kate Aldridge, Vicky Tucker, and Elizabeth Pargetter. No, that's a lie. I'm lying. I'm not focusing on Kate. Who wants to focus on Kate? I'm talking about Pip. It's like, hang on a minute, I'm not talking about her. Right. Helen. Now, Helen became pregnant as a result of marital rape by her then husband and serial abuser, Rob Titchener. You will be relieved to know that I won't be going over that harrowing storyline in any detail, but instead want to focus solely on her decision to keep baby Jack. Is that in keeping with reality? It's all but impossible to get exact statistics on the number of pregnancies carried to term that have resulted from marital rape, due to the nature of this violence. There have been a number of studies carried out on users of healthcare and refuge services, however. We know from women's testimony that pregnancy coercion exists. And there's good evidence that there is a link between intimate partner violence and unintended pregnancy, and that risk doubles among those women reporting both partner violence and reproductive coercion. Thus, I believe it can be considered realistic that Helen's decision to have Jack was in line with an expected outcome for a woman in her position. Number 2, Pip, the one that got me thinking about this all to begin with. Now, she got pregnant at the age of 24 after a condom failed. What do the statistical norms tell us of Pip's situation and her course of action afterwards? Now, with typical use, condoms are about 82% effective. So 18 women out of 100 will get pregnant in a year. So to become pregnant whilst using condoms is a fairly commonplace occurrence. Top tip for the future Pip, implants and coils are much more effective. 1 in 6 pregnancies in the UK is unplanned. And there's been a long-term rise in the percentage of conceptions occurring outside marriage or civil partnership, reaching almost 60% in 2016. According to the ONS, around a third of Pip's peers, aged 20 to 24, chose to terminate their pregnancies. So, in the light of that, her decision to have Rosie seems to be roughly in line with her age cohort. Vicky. I miss her. Do you miss her? Come back, Vicky. Now, she was found herself shocked to be pregnant in her late 40s, and she subsequently discovered the child would have Down syndrome. Husband Mike was heading towards retirement in his 60s, and he voiced concerns that they would struggle to cope with a child with additional and unknown needs. Vicky, on the other hand, if you remember, was always determined to keep the pregnancy. She felt this was her first and possibly only time to become a mother. Now, apart from a notorious and crude poll that the BBC asked listeners to vote on Vicky's decision, the storyline was broadly handled with sensitivity by the BBC, accurately, I believe, reflecting the soul-searching that forms part of the decision-making process. When trying to determine whether Vicky and Mike's choices reflect the national average, we're fortunate to have extremely accurate statistics for pregnancies where Down syndrome is diagnosed. There is also reliable data on the number of terminations related to these pregnancies in the National Down Syndrome Cytogenic Register. The register shows that Vicky and Mike's decision to keep Bethany was mirrored by just 9% of their peers. Parents have said that it's a particularly agonising decision to make because the condition can present so widely, such a wide range of symptoms, and it's impossible to know prenatally exactly what needs the child will have. So it's a very difficult choice to make. Bethany's needs seem to be at the lower end of the spectrum, and the joy that she's brought to Mike and Vicky's lives is evident. I'm just sad that we don't get to see more of her story. Last but not least, Lizzie. Now, like Pip, she was 24 when she fell pregnant, and she chose to have an abortion after conman Cameron Fraser abandoned her. I know, what a snake. He a bad man. He abandoned her in a car park off the M40. What a gentleman. Now, her story is of a naive young woman dating a mendacious and unreliable older man. Around 7 months into the relationship, she fell pregnant. Debbie took her to a local pharmacy to confirm. Now, Cameron, far from being delighted to find out he's become a father, coolly offered to pay for an abortion. And initially, Elizabeth was unable to countenance this course of action. After the abandonment in said car park, a devastated Elizabeth returned to the village. And Shula offered to adopt the child. Now, you may remember Shula and Mark were struggling to conceive at the time. Despite Shula's offer and her mother's protests, Elizabeth disappeared and had an abortion in a clinic in Felpersham. When she returned to Ambridge, she told her shocked parents that after much soul-searching, she just couldn't have the baby. Now, under the current legal framework in the UK, Elizabeth's abortion would likely have been carried out under Ground C, where continuing the pregnancy would pose a greater risk to her mental health than having the termination. 97% of terminations in the UK are undertaken under Ground C, and the majority of those are under the mental health ground rather than the physical health ground, about 99.8%, I think. No additional information is collected from these women. There's no requirement under law. So we only have anecdotal information as to the widely varied circumstances which lead people to seek an abortion. Now, Elizabeth's story is certainly dramatic, but I would argue is by no means any more shocking than many of the real-life stories that doctors witness daily throughout their careers. So, in conclusion, do the women of Ambridge behave normally when faced with an unexpected pregnancy? With such a small catchment area and limited demographic information, it's pretty hard to extrapolate, actually. There's only been 2 known abortions in Ambridge since legalisation in 1967. So on the face of it, that does seem an unusually low number. Looking at the national statistics, it seems likely that over the years several Ambridge women have gone to Felpersham shopping or up to London to visit a friend. Abortion stigma still exists, and the majority of people tend to keep their decisions under wraps to this day. They might only just tell a few close family members, perhaps the father. Thus, it may be that the scriptwriters are telling us only the stories that are more widely known in the village, and that Sabrina Thwaite, Carol Tregoran, Linda Snell, and perhaps even the Button Girls all have stories to tell that have eluded both Susan's hungry ears and our own. Thank you.
About all of that.
No.
So it's a bit of a peripheral question, but you mentioned abortion being legalised in 1967 just then. I've just checked on my favourite website, legislation.gov.uk.
It's not legal, it's partially decriminalised.
Yeah, so they actually just introduced an exception to the offence of procuring an abortion. I assume that's what the offence is. Do you think that that contributes to the stigma around abortion in any way? And do you think that the stigma could be addressed by some form of representation on the Archers, maybe?
Yeah, well, it's an interesting question. Thank you for correcting my false legal representation there. It is partially decriminalised, you're right, it's a retraction of a previous piece of legislation. I think the piece of the part of the legislation where women have to get the permission of two doctors to take control of a healthcare choice, which is completely out of line with any other healthcare decisions that we make. If we think about cancer or any other medical condition, you don't need sign-off or permission from two doctors to make that decision. So I think that contributes massively to the stigma and the way that these things are handled. Yeah.
I've got a couple. There is another thing which is comparable to that, which is trying to get sterilised.
Yes, no, of course. And gender reassignment, so I take it back.
Anyone who wants to hear stories about what you have to do if you're a woman and you want to get sterilised, certainly locally to me in Brighton, permission of my husband, yes, because I'm not my own person. I could go on about that.
Yes.
But what I was wondering was, I still find it quite frustrating that a lot of, not just the Archers, but in other dramas, sort of pregnancy, is someone going to have a baby or not, is quite a well-worn trope, and it seems to be quite an easy way to advance storylines, so I wondered what you thought about that.
Yes, I mean, looking at that, you know, we've had a dozen over the whole course of the Archers. It feeds back into those gender expectations that we were talking about earlier. It's a rural situation. It is expected, and we talk about Alice. She doesn't want to have a kid. She wants to stay in her STEM career, and it keeps coming up. Those expectations. It's a well-worn path, and we don't get many exceptions. The thing I will say is, having done the study for these case studies, is the scriptwriters do a fairly good job of exploring the differences. So they do a reasonable job of exploring alternatives. It's just that the majority of times they don't go with the alternatives. So it's slightly out of sync, I would say, with the national experience on very limited data.
So we're really struggling for time.
Oh.
Yeah,
Sorry, just one more question if we go there.
Yep.
Hello. I'd just like to point out that there's a difference between a miscarriage, a termination and abortion. I find it quite distressing that the whole three things have got different emotional labels.
Yes. Yeah.
And certainly growing up in a farming family, I was offered a place by the dairy farmer that I could keep my donkey in his farm because that would prevent abortions in cattle.
Oh gosh. Yeah, interesting.
But they are very separate.
Very separate. Yes.
And they have very different emotional
absolutely.
connotations with them.
We don't have time to talk about that, but some of the treatment of women in hospital.
Even with your commentary, you switch between between abortion and miscarriage or termination, and not miscarriage, but abortion and termination, and I think they're very separate things.
Interesting. Thank you. Yeah. No, but you're right. Treatment of women in hospital. There's lots of evidence of women going on to gynae wards with miscarriages, and it being very, very difficult. So yeah, absolutely. Still today, that women can struggle with that. Thank you.
Last question.
I noticed you didn't mention Phoebe and she took the money after birth.
Yes. Well, I thought about it.
Because
It was because it was unplanned pregnancy and she didn't get that far. So I excluded her because she took...
to show that there were alternatives out there.
Yeah, no, I just excluded her because she did take the morning after pill, which is seen as a form of contraception. So she didn't fall into my storyline. But thank you. Yeah, no, she's definitely up there. Thank you.
Really excited about this one.